Hi there everyone! Welcome to the second video for the first module of Introduction to Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies. For this video, we're going to talk about the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a really complex idea in feminist theory that has really taken off, in the last few years especially. It was heavily associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially in, analyses of people that were murdered by police, right? Breonna Taylor and so on, right? In order to make sense of their situation. And so it's become really, really popular. Like you'll see women in dating apps, for example, say that they're an intersectional feminist. And, ultimately a whole bunch of institutions are coming for the cultural credibility that comes with claiming that you are, in fact, intersectional. For our discussion post, for example, I will give you an example of the CIA actually claiming that they are, this kind of intersectional feminist organization, right? And if you know anything about the history of the CIA, right, then you very much know that they are not a friend of feminism or liberation movements anywhere in the world, right? So the question actually arises, has it been hollowed out of its meaning? Is it becoming so popular culturally that now all of these institutions are trying to claim it? What's going on with intersectionality? And for our reading for this week, I had you primarily focus on a very, very recent book by Patricia Hill Collins, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. We just read the introduction together, but it's a really, really, very recent but very interesting, unique book, right? So to begin with, we talked sort of about how intersectionality is becoming this big thing, but we haven't really introduced what it is. And part of the difficulty of doing that is that there is not really broad-scale agreement as to what intersectionality really is, even though a lot of people or institutions will claim in various ways to be intersectional. So I think that the easiest way to get a handle on what intersectionality is to talk about its history. So it begins with Kimberly Crenshaw. She was a legal theorist and was examining hate crimes cases, right? So, for example, if you are a black woman and you are the victim of a hate crime, right? I'm not sure if this has changed, but it used to be such that if you wanted to, try to prosecute for a hate crime, you would either have to decide that it was a hate crime based on gender or it was a hate crime based on race. Right? So if someone hates black women, for example, then, insofar as the prosecution claims that it was racially motivated, the defense could say, no, it was motivated by misogyny, right? And vice versa, as a way of kind of defending your client, in that case, against the hate crimes charge, right? So, of course, this left black women and other, racial and gendered identities at the intersection of various kinds of oppression in a unique and precarious situation where this hate crimes legislation was in some ways made to protect them, but is entirely ineffectual at doing so, precisely because of the interlocking nature of these oppressions, right? So intersectionality was meant to respond to the situation of black women, and in particular to build on earlier black feminist theory that critique one-dimensional analyses of race and gender. So, for example, and we will read much more of these sort of like classical texts in Black feminist theory later on in the course, right? But many early feminists would focus exclusively on how they were marginalized as women, and accordingly would exclude or, not take into account how their own situation meant that they dealt with unique situations, right? That was very vague. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that, for example, me as a white woman talking a lot about the nature of women's problems, right? I'm likely to focus on those problems that show up as in my life, right? And they, might be, in fact, are reflective of the fact that, like, I navigate the world as a white woman, right? And so issues related to racism, race, right, might, at least at first glance, appear like invisible to my social world, right? It doesn't show up as a problem for me. And so I don't, sort of build it into my feminist account of the world, right? And this is how you get very, very narrow and you could say myopic conceptions of what feminism is all about. But similarly, right, I have problems, right, being trans that cis women, right, might not also have. And so therefore, when they talk about the problems of being a woman, right, they might unknowingly only be talking about problems that apply to cisgender women, for example. And so the process of making our feminism more expansive therefore requires that we examine not just sort of like what it is to be a woman from one dimension, or what it means to be black or white or whatever from one dimension, but instead try to take into account multiple kind of forms of oppression and how they converge on a particular person as sort of a point of an intersection, right, of these different kinds of oppression, right? And so proponents of intersectionality therefore maintain that intersectionality is absolutely crucial to understand this particular situation of especially black women, but also various other sort of racialized and gendered minorities, right? If you take the sort of traditional one-dimensional way of approaching it, then you're not going to account for the particularities of the problems that emerge in these women's lives, for example. Now, the thing is, though, of course, that like after Crenshaw introduced the terminology of intersectionality, that it became immensely popular, right? Popular enough that the CIA wants to be intersectional, popular enough that people are intersectional in their dating profiles, right? Intersectional on Tinder and so on, right? And so this has sort of caused a general, you could say, proliferation, which just means spreading, right, of intersectionality, and sort of hollowing the meaning of this term, right? Now there's so much stuff produced within the supposed like paradigm or something like that of intersectionality that it no longer seems to even be about what it was originally about. And this is why I really, really appreciate Patricia Hill Collins' book, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, because she, for sure, has more credibility, like, dealing with the legacy of Black feminist theory than just about anybody on the planet. She wrote a very, very influential book on Black feminist theory that is now sort of recognized as, like, a classic in sociology. And this is her now taking on the idea of intersectionality and trying to really refine it, trying to really clarify it, trying to really clarify the role that it plays for feminists and for thinking about, feminist problems, for trying to end various kinds of sexed or gendered, or racial kinds of oppression. One thing that Collins notes that I think is important is that intersectionality is called a whole bunch of different stuff, and this is quite confusing, right? It's on the one hand called a paradigm, it's also called a heuristic, right? It's meant to kind of help you, right? But what does it help? It's meant to be a concept. People call it a framework or a theory. You could also say a method, right? So, obviously we kind of can understand intersectionality is something like a critique of an approach or something that was taken in feminist theory up to this point. But it's less clear what exactly the theory or idea or whatever of intersectionality is meant to be about. Is it a theory of our identities? Is it a theory about the nature of oppression? Is it a theory about how society works and how we should free ourselves or something, right? What exactly is it meant to do, and how far does it go? These are the questions that Collins really wants to put at the forefront of her work, and I think therefore makes it the best critical interrogation of intersectionality, right? Because it's not just saying, oh, let's go back to these one-dimensional approaches. Oh, let's ignore the situation of Black women and other people that are typically ignored by this one-dimensional account, right? I think we can all recognize that there are intense and perhaps intractable problems with a one-dimensional approach. But what exactly are we committing ourselves to, right? Are we committing ourselves to a social theory? Are we committing ourselves to a psychology? What are we doing when we say that our feminism is intersectional? And we might also raise this other question, what are the intersections, right? In the case of Black women, right, it's obviously the intersection of gender and race, right? That generates the particular problem or situation that was attempted to be articulated by Crenshaw and also by other forms of Black feminist theory. Right? But you could also talk about the intersections of class and sexuality, or the intersection of ability and sex, or the intersection of age and gender, right? What is necessary, right, for us to talk about an intersection in this case? Are we talking about identities? Are we talking about oppression, right? All of this is relevant in answering this kind of question. So it's okay, we reject a one-dimensional approach, embrace maybe a multi-dimensional approach. Fine, very good. What are those dimensions, right? What are the different ways that women's lives are, organized, administered, regulated, governed in various ways, either in their private lives through the family, or in the public lives through the state and various other bureaucratic organizations. And then finally, we might ask something like, with this, what even is the aim of intersectionality, right? Is the purpose of intersectionality to create more inclusive institutions, right? Is it to point out that because of, patriarchy and racism or something like that, that we are, likely to ignore or belittle the contributions of Black women and other gender minorities? How do we fix that? Do we just try to like make the institutions more fair by affirmative action or some other means, right? One, like kind of huge sector of the economy that is developing is partially in response to the problems pointed out by this paradigm is diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? That's like an office now that exists in most universities. That wasn't necessarily the case, 15, 20 years ago, for example. And the purpose of these offices, is to ensure something like gendered, racial, sexual, etc. justice, right? And their vision for how you do that is, well, you just fill the institutions with different kinds of people. And so is that like what intersectionality is meant to do? Is that really the spirit of what Crenshaw was doing, right? In one way, I mean, perhaps so, insofar as Crenshaw was trying to get the law, in some respect, to, respect the nature of Black women's situation, right? And so in that way, it does seem oriented towards a reform. And if that's the case, then it's not really necessarily all that critical, right? You can keep the CIA, you can keep, Facebook or, or frats or whatever, right? All you need to do is make sure that there's a diversity, equity, and inclusion office that can administer all of this stuff, right? This is one way that people take the intersectionality framework. But there is also, I think, a more critical and revolutionary way of thinking about intersectionality, right? And this is the way that Collins wants to think about intersectionality. This is, you could say, maybe the promise of intersectionality, which was, it was developed sort of after the civil rights movement and in concert with various sort of like post-colonial movements that were taking over across the world. And so they didn't set their sights on so little as requiring you to have a diversity, equity, inclusion office and to fill it with the right people and to slowly, ever so slowly, make your institution reflect, the people they serve and so on and so forth, right? To the contrary, these groups, these political groups, often saw themselves not just opposed to, institutions that are racist and sexist and so on, but they saw themselves as opposed to racism and sexism and the systems of oppression, right, that are rooted in these concepts. And so for this sort of, you could maybe say, strand of intersectionality, right, the purpose of intersectionality is to develop something like a critical theory of society. It's to figure out, well, how is our society structured, right? How is it that we have differentiation in, say, for example, how you're treated on the street or how much you're paid at your job or your possibility of getting fair legal treatment if you are arrested or you go to court or something like that. And so this approach would definitely require something much more expansive than the inclusion, DEI sort of approach. And doesn't just aim at, making our institutions more amenable, say, to our ideal demographics or something like that, but instead aim to overturn and critique the very basis of those kinds of institutions. So, much of this video has been about the ambiguity of intersectionality as an idea. It's been oriented towards getting us to answer various kinds of questions about what it is that we mean when we say, for example, that our feminism is intersectional. The purpose is not to reject intersectionality or even really necessarily to critique it. But insofar as we are feminists and insofar as we want to claim that our feminism is intersectional, it seems important that we are able to answer some of these very basic questions about the nature of intersectionality that tend to be overlooked by people that are, eager and anxious to claim that term. I'm very interested in what you all think. I'm very much looking forward to the second discussion forum for our first module, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.